Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of The Gathering. We're going to be talking about science and scientism tonight. If you don't know what scientism is, then you're in good company because probably no one in here knows what scientism is, perhaps apart from me. We'll be talking about that tonight. It'll make more sense here in just a little bit. But let's start with prayer because that's always a good place to start. Heavenly Father, we are grateful, Lord, to you.
Check, 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 check. I'm sorry.
Skeeven, how dare you? All right, well, now that we're past that. Okay, so science and scientism, yay for that. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Skeeven. Go ahead and put the first one up. There we go, yeah, there we go. So theology is the queen of the sciences. That's a statement that you probably don't hear very often and is probably somewhat confusing to you. You want to go ahead and put the next one up? I've quoted this several times in conversation, and people look at me sort of the way you're looking at me right now. This statement is pretty counterintuitive. You don't think of theology as a science, right? Because for us, science is, chemistry, biology, etc., okay? But for Sir Thomas Aquinas writing this, I don't know exactly when he wrote this, but I know when he lived, so I've just kind of guessed somewhere in the middle of the time that he lived and said 1260 AD, but I'm probably off on that. But somewhere around there. So when he said this, when he's talking about science, he's not talking about the scientific method and test tubes and all that kind of stuff, microscopes, all that. He's talking about the search for knowledge. He's talking about our attempt to understand things, like our attempt to understand while we're having technical difficulties tonight, right? So that's what he's talking about with science. And so from his perspective, theology is a science. Right, from his perspective, it is. But from our perspective, the way that we're trained today, the way that we teach people in school and all that sort of thing, theology is not a science. And this sort of goes into what we've been talking about for the past several weeks, right? The image that we've had in PowerPoint at the very beginning is that coexist bumper sticker. And we've been talking about other world religions and talking about, let's coexist, let's all get along with one another because it may be true for you, but it's not necessarily true for me, and all that sort of thing. That comes from the notion that theology, that studying God, is not an objective discipline. And so there's no objective truth when it comes to religion. And so therefore, theology cannot be a science. But that is not the way that we have always thought about this. In fact, science came out of theology. We wouldn't have come up with science, or at least most likely would not have come up with science if it were not for Christianity. So Christianity believes that we have an intelligible world as a result of a creator who loves us and wants us to understand him. And so when he created the world, he created it such that we could understand his creation. And so based on that, we actually study his creation to figure out what he created. And that's where science came from. If you look at a lot of scientists from way back when, a lot of them have theological writings as well as scientific writings, and in their scientific writings, they give thanks to God for science. And so the distinction between science and religion, the dichotomy between them, really didn't come about until evolution. That it really didn't come about until Darwin. And Darwin basically, with evolution in his writings, basically says if the immaterial world, and what we mean by immaterial is things that are not material, right? So immaterial world being spiritual realm or a soul or something like that. Darwin says that if that exists, his theory is false. Darwin actually says that. He says if there's an immaterial world, then my theory is false because his theory can't account for the evolution of an immaterial world. And so even he was trained to think about things theologically. He would have accepted that theology is a science, though perhaps not the queen of the sciences. And so he thought about the theological ramifications of his theory. He said, if I'm right, then there's no real moral responsibility. There's no immaterial world, there's no God, there's no lawgiver, there's no ground for morality, and so there's no reason to be moral, no objective reason to be moral. And so it wasn't until him that we had this distinction between science and theology. Prior to that, all the greatest thinking Christians were also scientists. You think about all the big names, they're all Christians. Now, you will hear, and perhaps some of you are thinking right now, well, what about the church and Galileo? Well, it'd be a long conversation, but essentially the way that we spin that now is pretty much wrong. The church didn't persecute Galileo. The church didn't really persecute science, actually. There's tons of people in the Middle Ages, High Middle Ages, that were scientists, and they were a part of the church. And so the way that we spin that historically just doesn't jive if you actually look at the data. It's sort of like the way that we teach the Civil War. If you're from the South, what's the Civil War about? The War of Northern Aggression, right? It's about states' rights. That's the way that we talk about it in the South, right? And everybody else is like, well, Civil War is about slavery. Well, look, slavery definitely factored into the equation, but it's more complicated than just the North didn't want to have slaves, the South wanted to have slaves. Civil War is way more complicated than that. And it's the same thing with lots of historical periods. We like to boil them down to really simplistic, that was great. We like to boil them down to really simplistic sound bites to say this is what this is about, but in reality, they're not really about that, okay? So that's just some context for this whole scientism thing. So let's go to the next bullet point there. So theology is a science, mainly because theology is a discipline that's concerned primarily with the discovery and application of truth. Like we said before, theology should be the most practical thing in your life. You know, I'm going through the Dave Ramsey thing, and I got really upset one night, the first night when we're in the Dave Ramsey video, and he's like, it's not theological because it's practical. And my wife leaned over and she was like, honey, don't make a scene, don't stand up, don't say anything. Because that upsets me, because theology is practical. The fact that theology is not practical, or the idea that theology is not practical, bothers me. Because theology is essentially understanding who God is. I mean, that's just what it boils down to. If you look at the origin of the word, it's from theos, logos. Theos meaning God, logos meaning word or reason or explanation. And so theology is fundamentally understanding who God is and explaining that to people. Well, that sounds really practical to me, right? If I have an improper understanding of who God is, that's going to have some practical implications in my life. If my understanding of who he is more accurate, that's going to have some practical implications in my life, right? Does that make sense? And so theology is a science from Sir Thomas Aquinas' perspective because it's primarily concerned with the discovery and application of truth. I'll go ahead and go on to the next one. And then, according to St. Thomas, it's the queen of the sciences, or to put it differently, it's the most important science one could possibly study. Now, if we think about that objectively, that's pretty obvious. If there is a God, understanding who he is more important than understanding anything else in the universe. It is more important to understand who he is than it is to understand who you are. right? It's way more important to understand who he is than literally anything else in the world. And so Sir Thomas Aquinas says that theology is the queen of the sciences. Theology is the most important discipline of understanding the universe that you could possibly engage in. And then he says, in addition to that, he says, and then philosophy is theology's handmaiden. He says that philosophy assists theology. And so from Sir Thomas Aquinas' perspective, theology and philosophy are actually the most practical things that anybody could engage in because they help you understand the nature of who God is, how he has revealed himself, and how we can interact with him. I know that that is drastically opposite of anything that you've ever thought or heard, that philosophy and theology are the two most practical things in the universe. But from Sir Thomas Aquinas' perspective and from my perspective, they are. And so let's go ahead, and the next one's basically what I just talked about, so we can skip over that. Let's go to the next slide here. Let's talk about scientism. You can stop there, that's good. So scientism, which is a term you've probably never heard of, scientism is the view that something cannot be true unless it can be scientifically verified. This is really, really, really common. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, or next point there, yeah. It's really, really common among scientists, obviously, because they're really big fans of their work. And so they think that nothing can be true unless they can discover it scientifically. But it's also pretty popular on a popular level, right? The reason that this is pretty popular, or the reason we can tell that this is pretty popular among just non-scientists, normal people, is think about the way that most people respond to saying that theology is a science. We automatically think theology can't be a science. Why can't it be a science? Well, because we can't verify it scientifically, right? We can't go through and do a test in chemistry or a test in biology and prove the Trinity, right? And that'd be nice, but we can't do that, right? And so automatically, theology can't be a science based on our understanding of truth, because we've been hornswoggled, so to speak, by this whole notion of scientism, right? Science is the only way that we can discover truth. That's a big problem. There's some gigantic problems with that, but let's think about that for a second. Go ahead and skip forward a little bit. Yeah, we talked about that just a little bit. There we go. Okay, so consider the definition of scientism again. Back up one more. Just one more. Yeah. Consider the definition of scientism again. Scientism is the view that something cannot be true unless it can be scientifically verified. Now let's think about that statement for just a second. Is that true? Is that true? Well, there we go, right? So this isn't true, because how do we go to the next statement? Is it true by its own standard? Let's think about that. If the statement says nothing can be true unless it can be scientifically verified, can that statement be scientifically verified? No. So that statement, by its own standard, cannot be true, right? There's no way that statement can be true, because let's think about it this way. This is the way that you would break it down in philosophy, okay? If that statement's true, then that statement's false, right? Does that hurt your brain a little bit? If it's true, then we use its truth to say, well, nothing can be true unless it's scientifically verified. That applies to this statement, so therefore this statement's false. Does that make sense? If we take the truth of the statement and apply it to the statement, it makes that statement false, right? So it's self-refuting. It's sort of like if I were to say, I can't pronounce any English words. That's a false statement. There's no way that statement can be true, because I'm using my correct pronunciation of English words to convey to you the idea that I can't correctly pronounce English words. Now, perhaps you don't like my accent and you want to take issue with the fact that I can't pronounce English words. That's another story, okay? But point being, it's self-refuting. So, Stephen, you want to go ahead and put the next thing up? That's just saying that that's what we call self-refutation, okay? And so that's a pretty big problem. If it's self-refuting, if an idea is self-refuting, that means that it's not just false, it's what we call necessarily false. Necessarily false means that that statement has to be false in every possible world. There's no thought experiment that we can even create where that statement could be true in a hypothetical world. It has to be false. And so scientism can't even possibly be true. Not that it can't be true in our world. No, it cannot be true at all. There's no thought. I mean, think for a moment of possible worlds where, perhaps I'm a millionaire or something like that, right? You come up with all these different possible worlds. What possible world could exist where scientism is true? That possible world cannot exist because the rules of logic are still going to hold, and that statement's still going to be self-refuting. So it cannot be true. This is a pretty big problem for people who are really big fans of science and kind of hate God. And there's an awful lot of those people. They walk around like they've got the answer to the universe, right? That science is the answer to everything, and something can't be true unless it can be scientifically verified. Well, that's self-refuting. That what you just said cannot be true. That's a pretty big deal. When you talk to somebody who's a really big fan of science, a lot of atheists are really, really big fans of science. It's really strange because a lot of atheists are really big fans of science, but they also are really big fans of relativism, which means that they don't really think that there's objective truth. And so it's really strange because over here in science, everything's objective and measurable and testable, but everywhere else, there's no truth. And you're like, well, wait, how do those work together? Like, how do you do that? Because over here, truth doesn't exist, but over here, truth is like the most important thing in the world. Right? You can't walk into a biology test and say, well, this is true for me, but maybe it's not true for you. Right? That doesn't fly. But somehow, everywhere else, that works. I was talking to Stephen about God's Not Dead earlier, and we were talking about how neat it would be to screen God's Not Dead and then talk about it, And so, hey, maybe that's something that we do one of these days. And so one of the points in God's Not Dead, the professor's espousing relativism, and the student says, you espouse relativism, but I'm pretty sure if I cheated on one of your tests, you'd give me a 0. So you're not a relativist, because if I cheat on your test, there's going to be penalties for that. That's not going to be relative in that moment. And so this is a pretty big deal for science, okay? It's a pretty big deal for people who are huge fans of science. So Russ made a good point. If you were talking to a scientist, they wouldn't necessarily agree that they believe in scientism, right? But the statement itself, they're not gonna say, they're gonna agree with that statement. If you're talking to somebody who's pretty heavy into science and they are an atheist, in general, they're gonna agree with that statement. Most people have never thought about that. That's the unfortunate thing about not teaching logic or philosophy or anything like that, is there's a lot of things that we don't think through, I was talking to some of my students the other day, just talking through some different belief structures and whatnot, and they kept saying, well, what about this, and what about this? And so I finally just had to tell them, if you're looking for consistency, you're not going to find it here. We were talking about Buddhism specifically, and Buddhism is fully comfortable with throwing logic out the window. I mean, they will flat out tell you A equals not A, logic is invalid, contradictions don't exist, right? And that's Buddhism. We haven't talked specifically about Buddhism because you don't run into a lot of Buddhists around here, and so I didn't want to spend an awful lot of time on things that you're not going to encounter. But if you talk to a Buddhist, they're fully okay with contradictions. You could tell them your belief structure contradicts, and they're going to say you rely too much on Western logic. But no, it contradicts itself. But yeah, that's totally okay, right? Because that's not the point. You're like, but and so I was talking to my students about it, and I was like, if you're looking for logical consistency here, you're just not going to find it. And so there's a lot of viewpoints like that have just been left unexamined. We've never really thought through them. And scientism is one of those. We have science sort of set up on this high bar that, like, science is perfect, and anything that science says, we have to agree with science. Well, science has problems. Like, there's lots of things that they're like, yeah, we're not sure about this. You talk to anybody that deals with quantum mechanics, and there's like a ton of different perspectives on quantum mechanics, and they're not entirely sure which one is right. And so, you talk to a scientist about it, and they're like, meh, like, I think it's this one, but I don't know, And so there's tons of things in science that just aren't objective like we would think that they are. And so scientism is kind of a big deal. You want to go ahead and put up the next one here? So if scientism is self-refuting and therefore necessarily false, we talked about necessarily false a minute ago. It has to be false. There's no possible world in which that it could be true. So what do we do with science? what do we do when we deal with people who are really heavy into science and all that sort of thing? As Christians, how do we approach that? Well, strict scientific worldview is typically purely naturalistic. And so if none of those words make sense, let me simplify that for you. As one of my students once said, let me say that again, slower in a different way. So what that means, what I've got up there is, as Carl Sagan once said it, if you were ever watched the original Cosmos broadcast, Carl Sagan once said, the universe is all that is, all that was, and all that ever will be. That was Sagan's perspective on that. Well, the interesting thing is if you watch Sagan, this is just mind-blowing to me, is that he's like, the universe is all that is, all that was, all that ever will be. And then later he would be like, you're made of stars. And you're like, well, how on earth do you know that you're made of stars? Like, you're making these gigantic leaps that are just, anyways, it was mind-boggling to me. But there are heavy problems with this view that the universe is all that is, all that was, all that ever will be. Namely, what do we do with a soul? What do we do with the immaterial world? How do we deal with that? If there's not an immaterial world, then everything that we experience on a regular basis is really technically an illusion. Your ability to make a choice is actually an illusion. Your ability to think is actually an illusion. You're just a product of chemicals. You're a product of neurons firing. You're not actually a person that can think and make decisions and all that sort of thing. You're a meat bag that has all these chemicals interacting that produce your personality, right? And for some of us, maybe that explains our personality, but for others, that's a problem, right? That's a really big problem with naturalism, is that ultimately it completely invalidates just about everything that we hold to be just intrinsically true, things that we don't even have to support, right? I don't even have to defend my right to think or have free will. That's just something that we all assume is true, or at least most of us, right? And so let's go ahead and put the next one up. I think I actually put that in out of order, so let me talk about this briefly, and then we'll go to the next one. This is kind of going to be a little out of order, but I apologize for that. God of the gaps, this is, when you're talking to somebody about science, here's what not to do, okay? So this is one of those moments where if you're going to stop paying attention at any point tonight, right now is not that point. This is what you don't do when you're talking to somebody about science. This is like the worst thing in the world that Christianity has ever done when talking to people about science. This is how the God of the gaps work. We talked about somebody about science and we say, well, yeah, but you don't know how, and you just pick something. You don't know how quantum mechanics works, right? Because right now they don't really know how quantum mechanics works. So we say, you don't know how quantum mechanics works. And they're like, yeah, we don't. And we say, well, that's God. God makes that work. And they're like, oh, okay. Well, then what happens one day when they figure out quantum mechanics? Then we have to find something else that God does, right? We have to find some other gap in their knowledge. That's why it's called the God of the gaps. It's the argument where we look for the gap in their knowledge and we fill that gap in with God. Well, the problem is that as their knowledge grows, God shrinks. And so hypothetically speaking, obviously this isn't possible, but hypothetically speaking, if science could answer every question in the universe, then God would cease to exist. That's a really big problem, right? That's a really big problem. That's not the kind of argument that we want to make for Christianity. We don't want to say God is relegated to your ignorance, right? And this, if you read Richard Dawkins, if you read any other atheistic scientist, they will actually expect our responses to be God of the gaps. They just assume that that's how we're going to respond to them. That's why, if you've ever wondered why a lot of people from a scientific perspective think that Christians don't think, their thought of us, their perspective of us is that we don't think and that we're not really concerned with learning and we're kind of stupid. It's because we make arguments like God of the gaps that rely on ignorance, right? They look at the way that we argue, and our God's existence requires ignorance. And so clearly we like ignorance because we like our God, right? That's their perspective on us. And so when we make these arguments, we end up feeding into their understanding of who we are to make them think that we are idiots, that don't like knowledge, don't like learning, don't like understanding the universe or anything like that. That is a really, really, really big deal. As I said on the PowerPoint, this argument does not end well for us. And so if you're going to talk to a scientist, you're going to talk to somebody that's a big fan of science, do not approach it from God of the Gaps, okay? Just don't. Just don't. That was a bad idea, okay? So here's the next thing. This is what I was thinking I was going to talk about next. I'm not sure how I got that out of order. You can go ahead and put both of them up. So what about the soul? Here's the big deal. This is the easiest way to argue against somebody who is a naturalist. There is an immaterial world. How do we explain that? How do you explain your existence? Not in like a cosmic sort of like, why are we all here kind of thing, right? Not in the, what are the big questions and the answers to the big questions and all that sort of thing. No, how do you explain the fact that you're a meat bag that, you know, chemicals fire and neurons and yada, 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 and then you look like you're a human being? How do you explain that? Outside of the immaterial world, outside of the existence of a soul, that doesn't make any sense. And so it's kind of mind-boggling when they try to argue with us their perspective, because from their perspective, we don't have the ability to think or reason or have free will, right? Because we're just chemicals and all that sort of thing. And so unless they get the right chemical reaction, they can't persuade us of their argument. So arguing is actually worthless from their perspective, so it just doesn't make any sense that they try to persuade you. It's like, you know, there's some theological positions that don't believe in free will, and I'll never understand why they try to convince you that free will doesn't exist. Well, if free will doesn't exist, I don't have the ability to choose to agree with you, so why are you trying to argue me into your position? That just doesn't make any sense. So it's the same thing with this. If that's what's happening, look, I can't remember if I have this up here. Yeah, I don't have this up here. Okay, so the problem with this, you know, there's a C.S. Lewis quote that I meant to put in here that's really great. I'm going to give you kind of my way less intelligent version of what C.S. Lewis said, because I'm way less intelligent than C.S. Lewis. But basically what he said about atheism, about evolution and all that sort of thing, is if evolution is what produced our ability to think, then why would we trust our ability to think? Because our ability to think was designed by evolution. It was designed by something that its entire goal, evolution, you know, the entire goal of evolution is survival. It's not truth. And so why would I think that my brain is capable of arriving at truth unless I think truth is intrinsically tied to survival? Let me unpack that for you for a little bit, okay? Let's say, hypothetically speaking, this is kind of a strange hypothetical, but just stay with me here, okay? Let's say, hypothetically speaking, that Walt, I'm going to pick on you, Walt. Hope that's okay. Let's say that Walt is on an island somewhere, and on this island are a whole bunch of tigers. And Walt is a really big fan of tigers. And he really, really, really wants to go give a tiger a big hug. Okay? Now, we can all see pretty quickly this is not going to end well for Walt, right? Unless something happens in his brain that makes him think the best way for me to get a hug from a tiger is to go hide in a cave and let the tiger come to me. If that happens, he will actually survive the tigers, right? He will survive. He will accomplish what evolution wants him to accomplish. He will accomplish survival. He will be the fittest, and he will accomplish survival. But he will have done so because of a false belief. See, the truth of a belief doesn't necessarily lend itself to survival. And so there's no reason to believe that evolution would produce a brain capable of arriving at truth. Because evolution's only going to produce something capable of surviving. And a brain arriving at truth isn't necessarily going to lead to survival. It's going to lead to, you know, maybe tons of other things, but it's not necessarily going to lead to truth, right? It's not necessarily going to lead to understanding the universe. And so the way C.S. Lewis put it is that why would we believe that the product of unguided, by chance situations produces something that can explain all of that? Why would we believe it? Like, how can it be possible that something randomly produces a thing that can explain all of that randomness? That doesn't make sense. Our ability to think is then undermined by the theory itself that we produce with our thinking. right? We get across the bridge of being able to think and then turn around and prove that we're incapable of thought by thinking, right? And so that eventually becomes self-refuting again. It becomes heavily problematic, and so that's the problem with evolution. That's the problem with our brain, our ability to think, all that sort of thing. I know that's kind of heavy, the tiger metaphor and all that sort of stuff, sort of heavy. Does that make sense? Are you guys tracking with me? Is that sort of with me there? Okay. And so that's one of the big deals with evolution. What did I think I lost an entire slide somehow. Go to the next one. Let's see. Go ahead and put up the next thing. Yeah, I think I lost an entire slide about evolution. That's fun. Yay! Yay, technology. It's just a great night for technology. So let me talk a little bit more about evolution really quick before we go into that, okay? So one of the hot button issues to talk about when we talk about science is obviously evolution, okay? It's one of those big things that everybody's, oh, this is crazy and I don't like it and all that kind of stuff, okay? So here's the big deal. Here's one of the big takeaways for talking about evolution as a Christian. Don't argue against evolution biblically, okay? I know somebody at church is telling you not to use the Bible. I know that is very strange and off-putting, and you're not sure what to do with that. But think about it this way. The person that you're talking to most likely does not believe in the Bible. And so you quoting the Bible is not very helpful, okay? As sort of like a tangent off of that, it's the same sort of thing when we talk about gay marriage, for instance. Try to quote scripture to somebody that's for gay marriage. They don't care about the Bible. That doesn't matter to them at all. You're not going to persuade them of your position by giving them the Bible because the Bible's meaningless to them. Okay, and so there's ways to make arguments against evolution. There's ways to make arguments against gay marriage and all that sort of thing without using the Bible. That's probably our best route. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use the Bible to develop your beliefs, right? One of the reasons that I oppose gay marriage is because of the Bible, right? But when I'm talking to somebody that doesn't believe in the Bible, I'm not going to use the Bible to try to persuade that person, right? Does that make sense? It's sort of like if somebody tried to support their beliefs to you using the Book of Mormon, right? You don't care. I mean, maybe you, I don't know, a little bit still, I don't know. Still got the burning in the bosom, maybe, I don't know, not quite. Yeah, so heartburn, right? Exactly. Yeah, but if somebody tries to persuade you using the Quran, you're going to say, well, yeah, I mean, that's cool and all, but it doesn't matter to me, right? It's the same thing with them. And so when you're arguing with somebody about evolution, the Bible, pardon me for a moment, but the Bible is sort of irrelevant to that as far as that conversation is concerned, because you're not going to be persuading that person, okay? The way that you persuade that person is to just show them the philosophical problems with evolution, right? There are just problems with evolution, like what we talked about just a second ago with reasoning. Our ability to think completely gets undermined in evolution. How can I trust my ability to think if evolution is not going to produce my ability to think? Like that just doesn't work. There's not a really good explanation there, right? There are other problems, like how do you get, here's another philosophical problem if you're interested. If you're not, then you can zone out right now. So let's say that there's a group of something or another that are evolving over here, right? And they're evolving from one thing to the next and all that sort of thing. Eventually they have offspring that's different from the parents, right? That's fundamental to evolution, is that you have species that change, right? So the parents give birth to something that's different from the parents. That has to happen. That's called speciation. That's one species changing to another. How is it possible that that occurs and the thing that is produced, that is a new species, somehow finds a mate of the same new species somewhere in the same region at the same time to produce offspring of that new species? That's like a gigantic gamble. And evolution assumes that that happens millions of times. That has to happen all of the time throughout evolutionary history in order for evolution to work. Now, if something's not guiding that, how the heck did that happen, right? There's a big problem there. Now, some people answer this by theistic evolution meaning, I believe evolution happened, and it happened because God made it happen, right? That's sort of the God of the gaps thing again, right? They want to accept that God did it, but he did it through evolution. They're trying to kind of live in both camps. there's a big problem with theistic evolution. Now, if you want to believe in theistic evolution, go nuts with it. Have fun with that. Okay, there's two big problems with believing in theistic evolution. One, let's say, you've got each of these chairs represent a stage in evolution, right? And so, these parents give birth to these children, and then these parents give birth to these children, and on and on and on. At some point in here, we have Adam and Eve, if you believe in evolution, right? If you believe in theistic evolution, at some point in here, we have Adam and Eve. And that means that Adam and Eve's parents are not human, right? There's a difference here. Adam and Eve are the first humans, okay? So Adam and Eve's parents are not human. Adam and Eve are human. And so the difficulty here is that somehow we have to explain that from here to here, these people can have eternal life. But these people are not people, they're animals, right? That's a really hard problem to solve in theistic evolution. You have to explain how, it's usually referred to as the evolution of the soul. How do these people, how can they be eternal beings created by the Heavenly Father, right? That they're going to live eternally somewhere. How can they be that, but their parents not? That's a pretty big issue there. The other issue is that if you want to get away from that by saying, well, Adam and Eve are figurative, right? That's one of the answers to that, is they say, well, that didn't happen because Adam and Eve are figurative. Well, if Adam and Eve are figurative, then how did sin enter the world? And so on either side of that, you got a kind of a big problem to deal with, okay? Does that make sense? That's kind of a tough thing with it. Now, I'm not saying theistic evolution is false. I'm just saying that that's a pretty big problem to deal with in theistic evolution, okay? Does that make sense? Let's go to the next thing here. This is related to that then. Age of the earth. Yay, age of the earth. Here's going to be one of those things that we're going to talk about that some of you are not going to agree with me, and that's just going to be okay, okay? It's just going to be okay. So, age of the earth, carbon dating is flawed, okay? If you're not aware of that, carbon dating does have flaws. And so there are examples of scientists using carbon dating to find out how old a tree is, knowing that that tree is 600 years old, and carbon dating says that it's 8,000 years old. Okay, there's tons of things that can throw off carbon dating. One of the things that can throw off carbon dating is if the thing you're testing has been submerged in water for a significant period of time. Anybody think of any examples biblically of something being submerged in water for a long time? Anybody? Yeah, maybe. Okay, so that can throw off carbon dating pretty significantly. There's a problem there. But it doesn't throw it off completely. And so we do have to reckon with the fact that there seems to be an appearance of age in the earth that is beyond what we would like to think. Let me go ahead and put the next things up. On the other side, the genealogies in the Bible do actually have gaps, which means simple addition of all of the genealogies is not going to most likely yield an accurate age of the earth. If we just take, so-and-so is this age, add that to so-and-so is this age, add all of those up. That's actually how we get the number of 6,000 years, give or take a little bit. There's a guy that added up all of that stuff, and he actually, I don't know how he did this, but the guy that initially did that, forget what year this was, but it was a while back, he went through all the genealogies, added up all the genealogies, and somehow arrived at Adam's birthday and time. Like he said, Adam was born on, I think it was like April 5th or October 15th at 9 o'clock in the morning in the year 4010 BC, right, or something like that. Right, yeah, right. He's off, right? He's completely off. Yeah, and so, I mean, that's probably a little farther than we want to go with that. But just to know that genealogies, we're not going to get an accurate age of the earth from the genealogies because they skip. And here's how genealogies in the Bible work, okay? They're not, one of the issues with science and religion is we try to make the Bible say things that the Bible's not trying to say. And so here's how genealogies work. Let's say this guy, again, we've got the generations here, okay? Each of the chairs represents parents and children. Let's say that this is Abraham, and Abraham begets Isaac, and Isaac begets, and then he begets, and then he, all that kind of stuff. In a genealogy, generally, you're actually going to start skipping people when those people aren't important. Now, that tells you something about genealogies because there's an awful lot of names in there, so they actually thought all of those names were important. That's kind of crazy, right? They thought all those names were important. But they're actually going to skip pretty significant chunks of generations because those people aren't important. Okay? And so they'll say, so-and-so begat so-and-so because, well, technically speaking, he did. Like he gave birth to that guy and then that guy, and then blah, blah, blah. And then this person is a descendant of that person, right? And so that's how genealogies in the Bible work. Now, they don't do that at every single step. Obviously, Abraham begat Isaac. That's, one generation. But periodically, it'll jump 2 or 3, okay? And so we can't just add up the genealogies to get the age of the earth. A lot of people do that. Sorry for beating the dead horse, but that's pretty frequent. Yeah. We can see by comparing genealogies that they skip generations. So you can look at the Old Testament genealogies and, for instance, compare that to the genealogies in Matthew and the genealogies in Luke, and you can see that one genealogy includes this person but excludes that person. And so it's pretty obvious that they're, kind of messing with it. For instance, Matthew's genealogy, he crafts the genealogy specifically to only mention 14 generations between, between Adam and Abraham, between Abraham and David, and then between David and Jesus, I think. Anyways, he does it in chunks of 14. The reason he does it in chunks of 14 is because if you look at David's name in Hebrew, you add up the numeric equivalent of all the letters in David's name in Hebrew, you get 14. And so when Matthew says 14, 14, 14, he's saying David, 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 and emphasizing the fact that Jesus is the son of David, which is kind of important in Matthew's gospel. Okay, and so he crafts his genealogies specifically for that. He doesn't falsify anything, but the way that he writes it makes that point emphatic. Okay, and so that's just one of those instances where we're trying to make the Bible say something it wasn't trying to say originally. Okay, so let's look at a couple of the views of the age of the earth. Young Earth creationism is sort of like the default view. This is the view that most people end up holding because it's kind of just the easy view to hold. If you just read Genesis and just follow along and try to take the most literal approach to everything, you usually end up somewhere around young Earth creationism. Okay, and this perspective is the Earth is about 6,000 years old, and this is held by a whole lot of conservative Christians. If we were all to sit down and really carefully think through our perspective on the age of the earth and all that sort of thing, probably most of us in here would believe young Earth creationism because that's, like I said, sort of the default view. Old Earth creationism, the Earth is older than 6,000 years. The age varies because there's a ton of different people that hold old Earth creationism to varying degrees, okay? And there's at least 3 views of this, probably a lot more, but we're going to talk about 3 specifically. So gap theory, if you know Genesis chapter 1 fairly well, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form or void, and darkness hovered over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And that's sort of how it goes, right? That's Genesis chapter 1, more or less, the very first few verses of it. Gap theory says there's a gap of time between some of those verses, that it's not just a direct progression of time, that if we read it chronologically, then we would see that it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness hovered over the face of the deep, and there's a gap of 30,000 years. Or something, right? That's what they would theorize. Is there's a big gap of time there, and then the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light, right? That's gap theory. There's a gap in there somewhere, okay? Sometimes they'll say it's after Genesis 1:1, so in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, gap, 30,000 years, 40,000 years, however long, and then, moves on from there. So that's gap theory. We'll go ahead and move on to the next one. Theistic evolution we've talked about a little bit already. Theistic evolution is the notion that God used evolution to create the universe, and so that they would take sort of a figurative approach to Genesis. And go ahead and move on to the next one. And progressive creation is sort of trying to straddle between theistic evolution and sort of the young Earth creationist position. So progressive creation means that God sort of used some evolutionary aspects. He let some things evolve, but he didn't completely use evolution for everything, right? And so that's how they approach that. And so that accounts for some of the passage of time and accounts for some of things looking like they may have evolved, but it also accounts for the fact that some things don't look like they evolved. And so that's progressive creationism. Old Earth creationism is incredibly broad. There's a ton of people that hold that, and there are lots of different positions there. the common theme there is that they think that the Earth is older than 6,000 years. Okay. Well, the Big Bang Theory is essentially just that the universe had a beginning, right? That there's some sort of explosion at the beginning, and so that's the Big Bang, right? And so that's pretty much everybody would hold to some form of the Big Bang. Even young Earth creationists would say, God said, "Let there be light," and there's something happened there, right? There was light. And so that would be a Big Bang. We may not call it that because we don't want to associate it necessarily with science, but everybody's going to agree with some sort of initial something, right? The crazy view, do I have a slide after this one? Okay. All right, let's go back. The crazy view, this is the just here, I'm going to toss something out for you that's just like, whoa, that's insane. And you can just do with it what you want, and then we'll look at some recommended books. Here's the crazy view. So, and if you don't grasp this, then that's totally okay, because this is kind of like, what? So, scientifically speaking, we can actually see that time, the passage of time, is affected by gravity. That's like a true thing, okay? So gravity can actually influence the passage of time. If you increase gravity, time slows down. If you decrease gravity, time speeds up. And so we can see this. For instance, somebody goes out in space, they're farther away from the Earth, gravity goes down. Our communication with them starts to get funny because the way that time's passing, all right? And so that's weird, right? That's just one of those things that you're like, what? Like that's weird, okay, I get that. But just think about the fact that, gravity affects the passage of time. So with that in mind, and this is crazy, I'm not saying this is true, I'm not saying this is, everybody, right? I'm not saying this is true, just tossing it out there because, hey, why not? If gravity affects the passage of time, if we think of here as right now, okay, everybody following me here? This spot right here, this is right now, okay? So time is passing at a particular speed here, right? Everybody? And if we move back this way, and let's say this is the moment of creation. At the moment of creation, everything is condensed into a pretty small amount of things, right? And the Big Bang, whatever that first moment was, everything explodes and starts expanding. And we actually can show that the universe is expanding, right? And so we know that it started as a clump of something, and in that clump of something, there was an insane amount of gravity. So if there's an insane amount of gravity at this moment, that means time is passing incredibly slow, right? But from our perspective over there, at the rate of time at which, or at the rate at which time passes over here, it looks like a lot of time has passed between there and here, right? From the perspective of here, it looks like a day passes, and from the perspective over there looking back, it looks like 100 million years passes. And so it would make sense, using this sort of paradigm, that if 6 days passes from this perspective, from God's perspective, so to speak, 6 days is passing. But from using the rate at which time passes now, looking back on it, there's 13.8 billion years or whatever, because the rate at which time passes now is so radically different from the rate at which time passes there. That is the only thing I've ever heard that seems to make some sense of both the literal account of Genesis being 6 days and the scientific perspective that there's 13.8 billion years since the moment of creation. It's the only theory that I've ever heard that seems to make sense of both of those, and it's sort of hard to wrap your brain around. And so I don't actually know enough about science to be able to say definitively whether or not that works. Science is definitely not my field, but that's neat, and I like thinking about it sometimes when I want to make my brain hurt. So that's fun. Okay. So the takeaway really quick, and then I'll recommend some books for you guys, because like I said, science isn't my field, so I'm going to have a hard time answering all your questions. The takeaway here, and this is important, okay? This is really important because there are some Christians that so strongly disagree with me on this point, and I think that's a really bad idea. Not because I'm awesome and I'm right, but because this is an important idea, and I would really like to see us come together on this, okay? None of the stuff that we've talked about thus far is a salvation issue. Okay? Yeah, amen, right? So it's really, really important that we understand that when Paul wrote Romans and he said, if you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that you will be saved. Or later in that chapter said, if you call on the name of the Lord, you'll be saved. He didn't add to that, and believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, right? He didn't say if you call on the name of the Lord and believe in literal 6 days of creation, you will be saved. This is not a salvation issue, okay? We talk about science not, in this sort of a setting, not so that we can show people that they're wrong, but so that we can have better conversations with people to hopefully get them to Jesus, okay? If I can get somebody to Jesus and they believe in theistic evolution, hey, let God sort them out. I'm good with that, right? Because they're at Jesus. I don't really care about their perspective on the age of the earth. But look, I know people right now. There are some big name people out there. If you know Answers in Genesis, they do some really great work. The guy that runs Answers in Genesis, however, has verbatim said on multiple occasions that if you don't believe in 6 literal days of creation, you're not a Christian. I take issue with that. That's a pretty big deal, okay? And so, they do some really great work. I'm not trying to say anything bad about them. I'm just saying that perspective, that we need to have a particular view of science and creation and all that sort of thing in order to be saved, is a bad idea. We need to be really careful about that, okay? Does that make sense, everybody? We need to be a little bit more charitable towards one another, because this just is not a salvation issue at all. Go ahead and put up the next slide, and you can put up the whole everything. So here's some books and authors that I would recommend, or go back, and put all of it up.